That's the last thing I remember about the version of myself that still hoped they would call. I was 24 years old, standing in the parking lot of a gas station just outside of Columbus, Ohio, with my phone in my hand and my heart somewhere on the pavement. I had just passed the bar exam. First attempt. I remember sitting in my car for almost 40 minutes after I saw my score, trying to decide if I should call home. I had my mother's number pulled up on the screen. My thumb hovered over it for so long that the screen dimmed and locked itself. I took that as a sign. I put the phone in the cup holder, started the engine, and drove back to my apartment. I ordered a pizza. I watched television alone. And I told myself that was fine. That was enough. It wasn't, obviously. But I was getting good at telling myself it was. Let me go back a little, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the younger of 2 daughters. My sister is 4 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to notice, she was the one who occupied the center of every room she walked into. Not because she was loud or demanding, she was actually quite quiet, but because my parents arranged themselves around her like planets around a sun. She was the first grandchild on both sides. She was the one my father coached in soccer, and my mother took dress shopping every spring. She was the one whose artwork went on the refrigerator and whose report cards got framed. I don't say any of this with bitterness anymore. It's just the geography of the family I was born into. I loved my sister. I want to make sure that lands before anything else does. For most of my childhood, I genuinely loved her. We shared a room until I was 12. We stayed up late talking. She taught me how to French braid hair and how to drive stick shift in an empty church parking lot on Sunday mornings when we were supposed to be inside. She was my sister and I loved her, and I assumed that meant something permanent. I found out in my second year of law school that it didn't. I had gotten into Northwestern on a partial scholarship. It wasn't the school my parents had expected. They wanted me closer to home, at Ohio State, where my sister had gotten her undergraduate degree, and where my father had season football tickets and a parking pass. Northwestern was 2 states away and significantly more expensive, and when I chose it, my father sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "You always have to make things complicated, don't you?" Not a question, an observation. I filed it away with all the other observations like it, and I went to Northwestern anyway. My sister had gotten married the spring before I started law school. Her husband was the son of one of my father's business contacts, a corporate finance type, handsome in a catalog way, with a firm handshake and opinions about wine. My parents adored him. My sister seemed happy, at least at the wedding. I was her maid of honor. I gave a speech that made people laugh and cry at exactly the right moments. And afterward my mother pulled me aside and said it was the most she'd ever heard me say at a family event, and something about the way she said it didn't feel like a compliment. The trouble started in my second year. I was doing well academically, top 15% of my class, editor on the law review, already fielding emails from firms. My sister had started her own thing by then, a small event planning business that my parents funded, and it was struggling. I only knew this because my aunt mentioned it during a holiday phone call. My sister never talked to me about it directly, but something shifted between us that year. She stopped responding to my texts as quickly. When I called home and she was there, she'd leave the room to give my parents privacy, which was a thing she'd never done before. I noticed it, but I didn't name it. I was 22 and busy, and I assumed it would pass. It didn't pass. In the spring of my second year, I came home from my cousin's wedding. I hadn't been back in 4 months. At the rehearsal dinner, I overheard my mother telling one of my aunts that I was having a rough time at school. I walked over and said I wasn't, actually, that I was doing well, and my mother gave me a look I still don't have a word for and changed the subject. Later that night, I asked her what she'd meant. She said she was just worried about me because my sister had told her I was thinking about dropping out. I wasn't thinking about dropping out. I hadn't said anything remotely like that to my sister or anyone else. I told my mother that. She nodded in the way people nod when they're deciding not to believe you. That was the first time I felt the ground shift. Over the next 6 months, the story apparently grew. I don't know exactly when or how, because I wasn't there for any of it, but by the time I came home for Thanksgiving that year, my parents had a whole architecture of belief built around something that wasn't true. My sister had told them gradually, carefully, the way you build a wall 1 brick at a time, that I was failing out, that I'd been lying about my grades, that I'd gotten involved with someone inappropriate and was in over my head and too proud to admit it. That I might not finish. I found this out at the dinner table, not as a confrontation, as an established fact that my parents were gently, mournfully referencing around me, the way you talk about a cancer diagnosis in front of the patient. My father said he'd been thinking I should come home and reapply to Ohio State. My mother said she didn't want me to feel like a failure because some schools just weren't the right fit. My sister sat across the table and looked at her sweet potatoes. I put down my fork. I said I didn't know what they were talking about. I said I was doing well. I pulled out my phone and showed them my transcript right there at the table. My father barely glanced at it. My mother said transcripts could be altered. My sister said, very quietly, that she was just worried about me and she hoped I knew the family was here for me, no matter what happened. I looked at her across the table and she looked back at me, and I understood in that moment exactly what was happening and why, and it was one of the loneliest feelings I have ever had in my life. I didn't scream. I didn't cry at the table. I finished dinner and helped clear the plates and drove back to my childhood bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what to do. I called my sister that night. She didn't answer. I texted her asking to talk. She replied, 20 minutes later, with, "I'm just worried about you. I love you." I typed back, "I know what you're doing, and I need you to stop." She never responded. I went back to school after Thanksgiving and I threw myself into work. I finished second year strong. I got a summer associate position at a federal public defender's office that summer, which was not the big firm route but was exactly what I wanted because I'd already decided that I wanted to prosecute, and understanding defense was the best foundation for it. I tried calling home a few times that summer. My mother answered twice. Both conversations were stilted and short, and both times she found a way to bring up my sister's wedding anniversary or my sister's new client or something my sister had said at church, and I started to understand that my sister had become the entire weather system of that household. When I came home for Christmas that year, my father pulled me aside before dinner and said he'd talked to someone at Ohio State admissions and they'd be willing to let me reapply for the following fall without the usual waiting period. I told him again that I wasn't failing out, that I didn't need that I didn't know where this was coming from. He put his hand on my shoulder in that heavy way he has and said he knew it was hard to admit when something wasn't working. I shook off his hand and walked outside and stood in the backyard in the cold for 15 minutes, and when I came back in, my sister was refilling everyone's wine glass and my parents were laughing at something her husband had said, and I ate dinner in 20 minutes and drove to a hotel. That was the last Christmas I spent with my family for 9 years. I finished law school. I graduated. I passed the bar on my first attempt in that gas station parking lot at 24, alone, watching the screen dim. I spent a year clerking for a federal judge in Chicago, which was one of the best years of my professional life and one of the lonelier years of my personal one. I sent my parents a card when I got the clerkship. No response. I sent a card at Christmas. No response. I sent a card on my mother's birthday. She sent back a brief handwritten note thanking me and saying they hoped I was doing well. Nothing more. By the time I was 26, I'd accepted a position with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. Assistant U.S. Attorney. Federal Prosecutor. The job I'd pointed myself toward since I was a second-year law student trying to prove something in a dining room in Dayton, Ohio. I wrote my parents a letter, a real letter, handwritten, 3 pages telling them where I was and what I was doing and that I was okay, and that I didn't understand what had happened but that I missed them. I got the envelope back 6 weeks later. Returned to sender, handwritten in my mother's careful print. I sat with that envelope for a long time. I made myself feel the whole weight of it before I put it in a drawer. And then I closed the drawer and I went to work. I built a career. I was good at my job, genuinely good, the kind of good that gets noticed without you having to announce it. I tried cases and I won them. I moved from smaller financial fraud matters up into more complex white-collar work. I was promoted. I got assigned to a new public corruption and fraud unit at 31, which put me in charge of the most significant cases in the office. I had 3 attorneys under me, and the kind of autonomy that takes most prosecutors a decade longer to earn. I also, somewhere in the middle of all of that, fell in love. His name doesn't matter the way that mine doesn't. We're all relationships in this story, I think. I'll just say he was a structural engineer from Milwaukee who I met at a mutual friend's dinner party in Chicago when I was 28, and that he was the most straightforward, uncomplicated person I had ever known. He asked me on a first date by asking me directly, over the dinner table, in front of 6 other people, whether I'd want to get dinner the following Saturday. I said yes the same way. We were engaged within 2 years. We got married in a small ceremony at a state park outside of Chicago, just close friends, colleagues, his family, who are wonderful and loud and who adopted me without a single condition. My parents did not come because I didn't invite them. I'd learned by then that hope in one direction could hollow you out if you weren't careful. My daughter was born 3 years into our marriage. She had her father's dark eyes and, according to everyone who's ever met her, my stubbornness. She is, without any hesitation, the best thing about my life. When she was born, I lay in that hospital bed with her on my chest, and I thought about my parents for the first time in what felt like years. And the thought arrived not as grief, but as something colder and more factual. They had a granddaughter. They didn't know. And they'd made choices, over many years, that led directly to not knowing. And those choices weren't mine to undo. I sent them a card anyway. A birth announcement. Their address from the last thing I'd had on file. I don't know if it reached them. I never heard back. My daughter was 16 months old when the case came across my desk. I recognized the name immediately. Not my sister, her husband. His company. A wire fraud and money laundering matter that had been building for 2 years before it landed in our unit. He'd been skimming from clients through a series of shell companies, laundering through real estate transactions, the kind of patient, meticulous financial crime that takes a while to unravel but is almost impossible to defend once you have. Our office had been building the case quietly. When my supervisor asked if I wanted to take lead, I thought about it for exactly 1 afternoon and said yes. I want to be honest about my thinking at that point. Part of it was straightforward professional calculation. It was a strong case, high profile, the kind of matter that mattered for the unit. But part of it, the part I sat with honestly that night after my daughter was asleep, was something simpler. I had spent 9 years being accused of things that weren't true. I had spent 9 years building a life that my family refused to see. And now the man who sat at my parents' dinner table while I was invisible was going to stand in a federal courtroom and answer for something he actually did. And I was going to be the one asking the questions. I told my husband. He looked at me carefully, the way he does when he's deciding whether to weigh in. And then he said, "Are you sure you can be objective?" I said I was a federal prosecutor and objectivity was the job. He said that wasn't what he asked. I thought about it, and I said yes. I was sure. Not because I'd stopped feeling anything, but because I'd had 9 years of practice separating what I felt from what I did, and that practice had made me very good at my job. The trial was scheduled for early spring. My sister's husband had been indicted in the fall and had spent months trying to negotiate a plea that our office declined. By the time we got to trial, he was represented by an excellent defense attorney, the kind of excellent that makes you sharper just by opposition, and the case was as well prepared as anything I'd ever tried. I was ready. I was, if anything, more composed than usual. What I was not prepared for was my parents. I walked into the courtroom on the first morning of trial, and I saw them sitting in the gallery, 3rd row from the front, on the defense side, which made a kind of sense I could have predicted if I'd thought about it. My father was in his good sport coat, the navy one he'd worn to every significant event since I was a child. My mother had her hands in her lap and her reading glasses pushed up on her head. My sister was sitting between them, leaning slightly toward my mother. I saw them before they saw me. I had maybe 3 seconds where I was the only one who knew what was about to happen. 3 seconds of standing in the doorway of that courtroom in my black suit with my trial bag over my shoulder and my notes in my hand, watching my parents sit in a courtroom waiting for a trial to begin, not knowing that the prosecutor walking through the door was their daughter. Then my mother looked up. I watched it move across her face in layers. Recognition first, something familiar about the posture, the walk, the cut of the suit. Then confusion, the kind that precedes a realization your brain isn't quite ready to accept. Then the realization itself. She put her hand on my father's arm, hard enough that he looked at her, and when he turned to see what she was looking at, his face went through the same progression in about half the time. I held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then I looked away, walked to the prosecution table, set down my bag, and opened my notes. Because that was the job. I heard the courtroom settle around me. I heard the bailiff call for order. I heard the judge enter and take the bench. The entire time, I was aware of my parents sitting 30 feet behind me, in a way that I can only describe as physical, like a pressure at the back of my neck. I didn't turn around. I had a case to try. The clerk read the case number and then read the parties aloud, as they always do. "For the United States of America," she said, "Assistant United States Attorney," and she read my full name and title into the record. The gallery was quiet, but I heard my mother. It was just a sound, not quite a word, the kind of involuntary exhale that comes when something knocks the air out of you. I didn't look back. My co-counsel, sitting next to me, touched my forearm briefly. She knew the situation, because I'd told her in case it became relevant, and then the judge was speaking and we were beginning, and I stood up and gave the most focused opening statement of my career. The trial lasted 11 days. I saw my parents every morning when I walked in, and every evening when court recessed. My sister stopped coming after the second day. My parents kept coming. I don't know why, maybe because they had no other frame for what to do, or maybe because watching me work for 11 days was doing something to them that I could only speculate about. Once, during a recess on the fourth day, I was in the hallway reviewing an exhibit when I heard my father's voice behind me. I turned. He was standing about 10 feet away, just standing, not saying anything, with an expression I had never seen on his face in my entire life. I looked at him. He looked at me. I said, "I need to get back inside," and I turned and walked back into the courtroom. The jury came back with a guilty verdict on all counts. When the forewoman read the verdict, the courtroom held that suspended breath that happens in the moment after a verdict and before anyone allows themselves to react. My co-counsel squeezed my arm. The defense attorney was already leaning down to speak quietly to her client. My sister's husband had his hands flat on the table and was very still. I gathered my papers. I shook hands across the table, the way you do, because the adversarial process ends when the gavel comes down. I spoke briefly to my co-counsel, and then I walked toward the back of the courtroom. My parents were already in the aisle, waiting. I stopped. There are moments where you've rehearsed something so many times in your imagination that when it finally arrives, you don't need to think. You just have the conversation. My mother spoke first. She said my name, just my name, and her voice broke on it in a way I hadn't anticipated and hadn't made peace with yet. I said, "I know you're not here for me. You were here for him. So you should probably go take care of your daughter." And I meant my sister, because she hadn't been in the courtroom for the verdict, and she was going to need her parents. My father said, "We need to talk to you." I said, "I needed to talk to you for 9 years. My mother reached out and touched my sleeve. Not grabbing, just touching, like she was checking whether I was real. She said, "We didn't know," and that was the one that landed. Because it was true, and it wasn't, both at the same time. They didn't know the details, but they had chosen not to know. There's a difference between ignorance and the willful maintenance of it. And I had thought about that difference for 9 years across breakfast tables in Chicago, while my daughter ate her cereal and my husband read the news, and I tried to be fully present in the life I had built without them. I said, "Yes, you did. You just chose her version. I wasn't cruel about it. I didn't need to be cruel. The facts were sufficient." The hallway was clearing around us. My father's hands were at his sides, and he was looking at me the way I had watched him look at my sister's school plays when she was young, like he was trying to memorize something before it was gone. He said, "I saw you up there. I watched you up there all week." He stopped. He tried again. "You were. I've never seen anything like it." I said, "I know." He said, "We lost all that time." I said, "You did. I was always here." My mother was crying by then, quietly, without drama, and I registered it and stayed with it without letting it decide anything for me. I had learned, over 9 years, not to let my parents' emotions perform the reconciliation for me. Grief isn't the same as accountability. Regret isn't the same as change. I told them that I wasn't going to have a full conversation in a courthouse hallway. I told them I had a daughter, their granddaughter, who I was not going to expose to uncertainty, and that if they wanted to be in my life, they would need to earn that through behavior over time, not through a single emotional moment. My father started to say something. I let him finish. Then I said it again, more plainly. I am not closing the door, but I am holding it myself, and I decide who comes through and when and how. My mother nodded. She said she understood. I went home. My husband was waiting with my daughter, who was in her pajamas because it was already past her bedtime. She ran at me the way she always does, full speed, arms out, like I've been gone for a month instead of a day. I caught her and held her against my chest, and she said, "Did you win?" Because she knows Mama goes to work and argues for good things, which is how we've explained the job to a 3-year-old. I said yes. She said, "I knew it," with the absolute certainty of someone who has never doubted me a single day of her life, and that, more than the verdict, more than the hallway, more than my father's face, that was the moment I finally allowed myself to feel the full size of everything that had happened. My husband asked how I was, later, after she was asleep. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I said, "I think I'm okay." And then I said, "I think I've always been okay. I just wished they were around to see it." He said, "They saw it now." I said, "They saw 11 days of it. They missed 9 years." And then I said, "That's their loss. It really is. I think I always knew it was their loss more than mine. I just needed it to stop hurting first." My parents reached out through a letter 2 weeks after the trial. My father wrote it. 4 pages, in his handwriting, which I'd forgotten was still the careful block print he'd always used. He didn't make excuses. He went through it chronologically. What my sister had told them, and what they had chosen to believe and why, and what they had told themselves to make that choice feel reasonable, and he named each of those things plainly without softening them. I give him that. I had not expected plainness. It was the letter I had needed for 9 years, and it arrived at exactly the moment it was capable of arriving, and not before. I called him back. It was a long call. My mother was on the line too, eventually. None of it was easy, and none of it was simple, and I'm not going to tell you we cried together and everything was healed, because that's not what healing looks like in my experience. What it looked like was a difficult phone call, followed by a second one, followed by a first visit where everyone was careful and a little stiff, followed by a second visit where my daughter climbed into my father's lap and demanded he read her the same book 4 times in a row, and he obliged without complaint. And by the end of the 4th reading he was doing different voices for all the characters, and my mother was watching from the kitchen doorway with an expression that I recognized, finally, as the one she used to have at my sister's school plays when she was trying to memorize something before it was gone. I'm not going to tell you I forgave everything. I think forgiveness is the wrong frame for some things. What I was doing was more like deciding, carefully and with clear eyes, what I wanted my daughter's life to contain. She deserved grandparents who showed up. She deserved to know where she came from. And I deserved to make that decision based on who my parents were choosing to be going forward, not who they had already been. Those are different calculations, and I was capable of making both. My sister and I have not spoken. That's a separate door, and I am not ready to open it, and I may not be. What she did was not a momentary mistake. It was a sustained, deliberate campaign that cost me years of my family and cost my parents a relationship with their granddaughter's earliest years. I don't carry it as active anger anymore. It just lives in me as a fact about who she is, and I've made my peace with that fact the way you make peace with anything you cannot change by acknowledging it, not by pretending it away. What I keep coming back to, when I think about all of it, is the question of whether it was worth it. The silence. The years of building something alone in Chicago without anyone from Dayton knowing. The bar exam in the gas station parking lot. The wedding without my parents. The birth of my daughter where I was the only person in the room who knew she had grandparents who'd sent back her birth announcement unopened. Here is what I think, for what it's worth. I think the silence made me better at my job. I think having nothing to prove to anyone in Dayton made me very clear about what I was doing and why. I think building a life without a safety net teaches you a different relationship with your own capability. I think the 9 years of not being seen by the people who were supposed to see me made me exceptionally good at seeing other people. My clients, the witnesses I worked with, the jurors I read during trial. I built something real in those years, something I own completely. And I think my daughter benefits from a mother who knows exactly what it costs to maintain your integrity when no one is watching. Who knows the difference between being believed and being right? Who knows that the most important person in the room to answer to is yourself? The last time I saw my parents, they were sitting at our kitchen table on a Sunday morning, and my daughter was showing my father how to make a paper airplane using a method she had invented herself, which did not result in anything that flew, but which she defended with tremendous conviction. My mother was washing strawberries at the sink. My husband was reading the paper. The kitchen was full of the ordinary noise of a family on a Sunday morning, and I stood in the doorway for a moment and just let it be what it was. Not healed, not fixed, not erased, just present, just here. I went in and sat down, and my daughter immediately enlisted me in the paper airplane crisis, and my father caught my eye over her head, and something passed between us that I don't have a clean word for. Not forgiveness exactly, maybe just recognition, the acknowledgement that we were both still here, in the same room, trying. I'll take that. For now, I'll take that.